Welcome to GS Podcast number 106. I'm Stephen Knight and I hope you're all well. This will be the final podcast for November, just squeezed it in. There's already a Taking the Myth discussion show out. Me and Iram Ramzan cover all the big topics from the last few weeks, so make sure you download that via iTunes or Stitcher. It's also on YouTube at youtube.com/gspellchecker. Very pleased to bring you this episode with Tom Wilson from the Henry Jackson Society. Tom specialises in counter-terrorist strategy and extremist groups, both domestic and abroad. And he's recently been involved in producing a report on a group called MEND, which made for fascinating reading. In the UK, we seem to have a problem of a number of soft Islamist groups that attain legitimacy by forging alliances with elected officials or being the go-to mouthpiece for our news media. So we talk about that and a whole host of pressing issues and topics. And I really enjoyed it. Tom's obviously a very bright, knowledgeable individual, so I'm pleased to be bringing you this conversation. Don't forget, you can keep up to date on this podcast by visiting gspellchecker.com. Enjoy! I'm very pleased to welcome Tom Wilson from the Henry Jackson Society to the GS podcast. Welcome, Tom.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. How's it going?
Yeah, good, thank you. Not bad. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Not bad for this time of year in very blistery Britain. It's rough up north. I don't know if you know this.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty freezing down here in London right now, but friends in Newcastle have been sending me pictures of snowy scenes, so it sounds like you've got it worse.
Yeah, I love how British we are. We kick off talking about the weather straight away. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background. How did you come to end up at the Henry Jackson Society?
Sure. Well, I mean, at Henry Jackson, I focus mostly on counter-extremism and counter-terrorism, both domestically and also particularly in other Western countries in North America, Europe. And I've done some work on the Middle East as well, particularly in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I guess that's how I got involved in this area. I was doing some work in journalism, both in London and also in the States, out in New York, and following a lot of the stuff that was happening with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict quite closely. And I thought it was interesting how, both in terms of who some of the threats were in terms of terrorist organizations and some of the existential threats that were being faced in Israel, there were increasingly parallels with groups that we were facing here in the West and in Britain. And also I felt that there was a moral relativism on the part of intellectuals, parts of the political establishment, parts of the left-leaning media, in how they thought about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I felt that it lacked moral clarity, and that there was an inversion basically taking place in how they thought about that issue. And then I felt that you could see exactly the same thing happening when it came to either British policy on defence or British policy on fighting extremism and terrorism here. And so it felt as though if you were going to be able to combat that problem on either one of those issues, you were going to need to deal with it in the whole. So I guess that's how I got interested in this area.
Great. And how would you describe the Henry Jackson Society in terms of what they do, what their ethos is? Because, of course, there's a very large focus on Islamism. Of course, it's one of the great problems of our day. But obviously, I think the think tank in general is probably very conservative-leaning. A lot of people will throw around the terms far-right or neoconservative. What do you have to say about those kind of things?
Well, I mean, we're a counter-extremism and security think tank, and we also deal with geopolitics as well. But fundamentally, from sort of, you look at what our objectives are of the things that we stand for, it's democracy, human rights, and freedom, taking those sort of, they're quite American values. We're named after an American Democratic senator who was sort of a Cold War warrior, despite the fact that he might be associated with the left. He was a part of the left that nevertheless stood up very firmly against the Soviet Union and stood up for liberty against the tyranny of communism. And it is true that we're called conservative, although we work with people from across the political aisle, and I think that it's a great sadness, and that people on the left should feel very sad if democracy and human rights have become the preserve of conservatives, or if people see those of us who are standing up for Western values on those issues as being a conservative thing. I think that people on the left ought to feel just as much that they have ownership of those terms, and it's a sign of how the left, I think, has failed on human rights issues a lot of the time, and holding everyone to the same standard, that now apparently organisations like mine that promotes Western democracy, that's now seen as being a conservative thing to do.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I consider myself left of centre. However, that's becoming more and more murky. I'm not kind of sure where the lines are drawn anymore. But I was just having a conversation last night on the podcast, and I actually made the point that every time I look around for the staunchest defenders of free speech at the moment, they seem to be on the political right, which is very strange, given fighting for free speech and liberalism was once considered the realm of the left. What do you think's going on there?
I mean, it could be that thing to do with how the left itself has changed, which is that maybe conservatives by their nature tend to sort of stay the same, but the left in the West has undergone rather a transformation. I know that people like the neoconservative thinker Irving Kristol spoke about this in the 60s, and we of course have been called a neoconservative organisation, and we do have some of our tradition, I think, does come from there. But Irving Kristol said, he was a liberal in the 1960s, but he basically said to go from being a liberal to a conservative at the time, you just had to stand still, that you just had to hold the same set of principles and values over a couple of decades, and suddenly you find that the left and their centre of gravity had moved, so that it now put people who were in the centre or moderately on the left, they suddenly found themselves more in the right. Because I suppose what's happened with the left is that it has become, unfortunately, increasingly hostile to its own society and culture. And I'm talking about the far left here. I think it's right to distinguish that, and that's not true of lots of social democrats. I'm talking about the far left. But the far left has become hostile to its own culture and cultural values, and I suppose in the way perhaps the people on the far left became disillusioned with the failure of the working class and the proletariat to do what they thought they were supposed to do under sort of left-wing dogma about the proletariat. That failed to happen. They didn't bring about this revolution like they were supposed to, and I think they went in search of new allies and new people to help them overthrow a system that they don't believe in, and that has led them to align themselves with some very authoritarian and extreme elements, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, before we touch on those elements, I think, as someone on the left myself, and I do enjoy a good bit of left bashing, mainly because I see them as my team. It's almost like a cleaning house exercise. But I just wonder, how do you view the so-called domestic far right? This term domestic far right usually applied to non-Islamist based factions and groups and political, extreme political viewpoints. How much of a problem do you think that still is in Great Britain in 2017?
Well, I think in a way it's not so much a question of still, as in there's some residue left over. It's almost the opposite. It's becoming an increasing problem, I think, in Europe, and definitely there's some issues in North America as well. And the problem that we're facing, I suppose, for people who believe in liberal democracy and a sort of consensus around individual freedom is, there has been somewhat of a growth on the extremes, and the far right, I think it feeds off of a couple of things. One is the failure of the political establishment to get to grips with things that ordinary people are very worried about, and to talk about that in a fair-minded and sober way. And so instead they find the only people who are talking their language on their concerns about immigration are people who are actually quite extreme, for instance. And also I think that what's happened is that the far right has been able to use the Islamist threat as a means by which to rally, which is interesting because people on the Islamist end have also used ideas about Islamophobia and the rise of the far right to rally people in their community to join them. And so you've got this terrible situation emerging, or at risk of it emerging in a serious way, where the two extremes exist in a sort of reciprocal relationship where they feed off of each other. And both of them have this sense that they want to try and bring about some kind of bigger societal clash between the two far poles of the Islamists and the far right, and they would, I think, you could see an escalating situation if they were allowed to get out of hand, where you would get sort of spiraling violence on the two sides, and I think that's something that the people in the middle and the vast majority of people need to be wary about and try and guard against.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, is it not? Do we not have a problem here in the sense that really what we want is anti-Islamism, anti-extremism attitude to be more popular to attract more people? But the problem then is the more people you attract, the likelihood of you then bringing in racist and bigots, and before you know it, you're the next EDL or something like that. I've been to like anti-Sharia marches, and it seems to me that the bigger the numbers there, the more likely you are to bring in some nefarious elements. Is it possible to beat this idea of Islamism and extremism with and excluding those type of people at the same time?
Well, I think it definitely should be possible to exclude them, although it is difficult. And, this is a point that other people have made, which is that if you try and set up a movement to be anti-Islamist extremist and you're concerned about issues to do with the imposition of Sharia, as you mentioned, and if the media and the political mainstream immediately labels you as far right, well, that means you are then attractive naturally to people on the far right who then look at you and say, well, these are my allies. And so it's not surprising then that when people who are just counter-extremists get called racist, that the actual racists think, well, you're obviously my natural political bedfellows. So that, I think, helps, unfortunately, push these two people into the same camp, because of course really the people who are anti-extremist are the liberals, because we're the ones who are trying to stand up against religious authoritarianism. So I don't think we belong with the real far right at all. I think we have a completely different worldview. I think it is true that as a movement gets bigger, that it's harder to filter who's sort of coming in. But part of the solution, I think, has to be the mainstreaming of some of the ideas associated with counter-extremism. And I think also they have been mainstreamed a bit more, and that people in the middle in sort of the centre ground are a bit more comfortable with recognising that it is possible to talk about extremism and Islamism without tarnishing all Muslims, and that they understand that there is a distinction between the term Islamist and Islam. And I think more people increasingly know what we're talking about in those situations.
Yeah, I agree. I want to touch on the latest report that you've published that you played a big part in, and I'm not entirely sure what you can talk about it specifically, but it's titled MEND, Islamists Masquerading as Civil Libertarians. Maybe you could just explain who MEND are in the grand scheme of things. Yeah,
well, they're a organization, a Muslim organization, which, in the way in which they brand themselves, are primarily concerned with fighting Islamophobia and increasing Muslim political engagement. But they previously existed, before they became MEND, they were something called iEngage that had been set up in around 2008. And as iEngage, they did have a record of being associated with extremist speakers, and there were concerns about things that had been said by people who were part of the organization. And so in around 2014, it underwent this rebrand to become MEND, and has certainly become far more active in terms of both its political activities with politicians and in Parliament, as well as its campaigning on the issue of Islamophobia. But nevertheless, some of the individuals and the people who they were associated with when they were iEngage hasn't changed, and people who worked in the organisation in its previous incarnation are still there, and some of them have a series of very concerning statements and beliefs that they've expressed in the past. I think it's important to say that when you're talking about groups who you would class as Islamist, and I think there's a strong case for saying that there are certainly people in Mend and who have a philosophy that can be described as Islamist. That there's quite a broad spectrum of what we're talking about. So there are some people on the Islamist spectrum who I think everyone would instantly recognise as extremist, and there are other people who sort of straddle the two worlds of normal activism and community engagement. And in a way, that's when the conversation becomes a lot more difficult, because no one is looking to exclude Muslim engagement in the democratic process. But I think there's always concerns about, what do some of the people who are involved in that campaign, what are their real objectives, and what do they really believe deep down. And so the project that we produced on Mend, in a way, it was about so much more than just that one organisation, because it touched on a whole range of other organisations that Mend partners with and other individuals, that opens up this entire world for people to see through the report, of where there are people with some incredibly extreme opinions and beliefs, and who campaign on some very extreme issues that I think a lot of people in the British public would have no sympathy for, and the way in which, through talking the language of combating Islamophobia and increasing Muslim participation, there are a lot of people in the world of interfaith, as well as on the political left particularly, who want to be very open to that. And so unwittingly, I think you can have a situation with some of these groups where the door is sort of opened to far more extreme elements than people would have ever wished to have become involved with.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it's a problem as well that many of our journalists and media hosts are not entirely familiar with the religion in the same sense that they would be with Christianity, with it being a sort of culturally Christian society, and they're not entirely sure which probing questions to ask? For instance, a lot of these individuals who front these organisations can seem quite reasonable and liberal in the way they speak, but the moment you press them on specific topics within the Islamic faith, they tend to, the mask slips, they tend to reveal themselves, and I just don't see a lot of people challenging them specific issues enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think that something that unfortunately seems to happen is that people just don't apply the same standards across the board, and they don't seem to, if a group of people who were Christian came to you and they had a political program that was primarily based on, in one form or another, trying to impose Christian values, never mind that, of course, traditionally this has been a Christian country, so some people might already view that as legitimate, but who were seeking to try and promote and impose religious belief through politics, I think people would, I think a lot of people would have a problem with that. And I don't think that they always, or they often clearly don't, ask the same questions and apply the same standards from people from all religions and all communities. And then I think you've also got the issue of whether or not, if you take an issue such as, homophobia or women's rights or the promotion of religious violence, again, whether or not people hold, say, somebody who's Christian to the same standard as they might from somebody from another religion, and they sort of almost decide in a rather patronizing and belittling way, oh, well, that's their culture, that's their community, they can have their beliefs, kind of thing, and we don't ask them about it in the same way that we would if it was a evangelical preacher, for instance.
Yeah, I think a while back a Tory MP came out against, I think it was either gay marriage or abortion, one of them, and he was rounded on quite harshly by the media. I mean, quite rightly, I would imagine, but you just don't see the same attitude towards the Muslim opinion on these topics. I mean, I pointed out ignorance there, perhaps, of the religion in general. Is there not another aspect of this as well, that a lot of these groups are anti-West in their rhetoric, and there seems to be a great appetite for that sort of self-flagellation on the far left as it is, and these groups kind of provide that validation for them?
Yeah, completely. I mean, the message of groups that the narrative that you can pick up in an organisation like Mend, that you with other organisations that work on similar issues such as Cage, is they have this message, which is essentially to say that not only are our society's Islamophobic often, and the British government policy is Islamophobic. But when it comes to an issue such as terrorism, for instance, that terrorism is actually caused by us, but for being Islamophobic, for ostracizing Muslims, and through our foreign policy. And of course, that is music to the ears of people on the far left who opposed British foreign policy in the first place. And so, they can build partnerships with Muslim organizations who will say the reason that you're having terrorism is because of your foreign policy, and they will say, that people who carry out terror attacks have foreign policy grievances. This seems to sound perfectly reasonable to a whole group of people on the left, but I wonder what would happen if you spoke to them, for instance, when we mentioned about the rise of the far right, and we have seen instances now of far-right terrorism here and in Europe, and if you said to them, oh, but the far right, when they carry out terror attacks, that's just because they have racial grievances or they have immigration grievances. Nobody would think, oh, that's reasonable, well, that's fair enough, they disagree with us, therefore that's why they carry out terror attacks. They would say, one, your beliefs are completely abhorrent, and two, just because you do not agree with our policy, that does not give you the right to resort to violence to try and change and influence it. But instead, people on the left are willing to partner with Islamist groups who peddle this message that terrorism is our fault, that it's our fault when we are attacked and blown up. And essentially, it takes all moral responsibility away from the people doing the attacks and holds us culpable and obliges us to change government policy back in line with what people on the far left wanted it to be in the first place.
Yeah. So I wanted to touch on Jeremy Corbyn a little bit, because a little while back I would have said he's no chance of reaching number 10. The idea seemed laughable to me. Now I'm not so certain. I'm a little bit concerned that actually we might be looking at our next Prime Minister. It's not as unthinkable as it was. And he's also recently been a guest speaker for a MEND event. So what we have here is a group that may have Islamist leanings, have the ear of the future Prime Minister. What's going on with this alliance, do you think?
Well, Corbyn had spoken actually for when MEND was called I Engage in the past, because then he was just a backbencher. He had spoken for them then. He also has spoken at, there's a campaign group called Stand Up to Racism, which partners with MEND and hosts MEND speakers, and Corbyn has spoken at their conference. So in a way, it's not surprising that he ended up speaking for them in Parliament. And, a senior person in MEND claims to be familiar and acquainted with Corbyn, so it may have been that they've been mixing in the same milieu for quite some time. And I think, it does raise a question about people who consider themselves progressives on the left, because the question is why is it that if you go to progressive Muslim organizations, as I do, and you go to their events, Muslim organizations that are interested in opposing extremism, you don't see the far left there on the whole. You don't see the sort of the Corbynista type leftists there, but you do see them teaming up with and at the events with the hardline Muslims and with the Muslim ultra-conservatives and with the theocrats, essentially, which is rather strange when you think that the left has generally been in favour of secularism, and yet here they are teaming up with religious conservatives. There's this very strange sort of cognitive dissonance going on their part. But again, I think it comes back to this thing of people on the far left, the Corbyns of this world, they have to find their allies where they can, and I think in the Islamists, they find a group of people who are as hostile to the West as indeed they are. Yeah.
So would you characterise Corbyn as anti-West?
Well, it's strange, I think, with Corbyn how the wars that he has tended to oppose in his career, and the countries that he's been critical of, are often Western and Western aligned countries. He doesn't seem to have the same hostile attitude, and doesn't focus on the wars waged by non-Western countries. And he seems to sort of, when he's questioned on about associations with, the IRA, or with being open to meeting with Hamas and Hezbollah and that kind of thing, his answer is always that you have to meet with people on all sides, which I suppose would stand up if he actually did meet with people on all sides. But obviously, as we saw the same week that he spoke for MEND in Parliament, the Israeli Prime Minister was visiting, and to my knowledge, I think about the week that Benjamin Netanyahu was in the UK, I'm not aware that Corbyn met with him once. So actually, when it comes to speaking to people on all sides, he really doesn't. So I think that gives you some clue about where his leanings might be.
Yeah, he's not inviting any pro-Zionists to the table as far as I can see. No. So we've touched on MEND. What other groups of note? I mean, we don't seem to have any shortage of these kind of soft Islamist groups that provide a sort of funny, like a cuddly face of Islam for our TV. And when you scratch the surface, there's some very concerning elements. One of them that I think seems to be finally getting the negative press it deserves, although it doesn't seem to be going away, is the group Cage. What can you really tell us about them?
Well, Cage has been campaigning for quite some time on similar issues to MEND when it comes to legislation trying to prevent terrorism. And you may know a bit about our prevent counter-radicalisation strategy in this country. And, it's been fiercely opposed by both MEND and Cage, often without any very detailed or convincing explanation of what they would put in its place. And Cage has certainly adopted the narrative again that actually what causes terrorism is apparently our counter-terror measures, which I think many people would just find laughable. But they have had a particularly concerning record with, statements that senior people in Cage have made about so-called jihadi John Mohammed Emwazi, the IS executioner who, of course, came from West London, describing people like him as a beautiful young man, justifying people who go on jihad, whether or not to fight, again, British and American soldiers in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I think, that raises serious questions when you talk about what is a moderate position and who are really moderate groups. And yet, Cage couches itself in the language of civil liberties, opposing counter-terror legislation on the grounds that they're standing up for human rights and civil liberties. They also, again, have a pretty serious record when it comes to inviting extremist speakers to their events, including people like Shakil Beg, who was found to be an extremist in the High Court for having promoted jihad. So those are the kind of people that Cage aligns itself with. And of course, we did have the rather concerning incident recently when Max Hill, the independent reviewer of terrorism, decided to meet with Cage. And he did it on the grounds that he needed to hear from, as an independent reviewer of terror legislation, he needed to meet with people on all sides to hear what Cage had to say. But it's not as though it's any secret what Cage thinks. There's nothing, to my mind, that Cage could have told him that he couldn't have found out from reading, reams and reams of reports that they put out and their videos online. But he did give them, in meeting with them, a certain degree of legitimacy. And I think it was very concerning that not long after he had met with Cage, he then seemed to backtrack on whether or not we should be arresting and criminalising people who've been to fight in Syria. So you wonder, what effect that conversation had on him, because this is, of course, the line that people in these soft Islamist groups have taken, which is that people who've gone to go and fight in Syria shouldn't necessarily be criminalised when they come back to the UK.
How do you feel about that topic personally? I know Justin Theroux's just made some comments about that in Canada, about trying to reintegrate or providing support and help to returning ISIS fighters. What do you think is the correct approach here?
Well, first of all, there seems to be quite a clear moral approach, which is that I can't think of many other cases where there have been war crimes and atrocities, which there undoubtedly have been in Syria, at the hands of ISIS, and it's highly likely, as we saw with people like Mohammed Emwazi, that the British people, whether or not they intended to go out there to get mixed up in it or not, but it wasn't difficult to find out what kind of a group ISIS was, even quite early on in 2014. It's quite likely that those people were in some supporting role, if not directly involved in war crimes and atrocities. And, usually those people are put on trial and they're punished. I think that if somebody, we saw what happened, for instance, to the Yazidis, to Yazidi women, what was done to civilians under ISIS control. And I think that if those people have been involved with that, then of course they need to be prosecuted and punished. So that's the moral issue, aside from the security issue. And of course, tied up with that issue of prosecution is the fact that it's very, very difficult sometimes to get evidence or witness statements on what people were doing in the middle of Syria, which raises another question, which is that if people do return, how successfully can we prosecute them? But in any case, I think that we have now surely seen enough instances in Europe with the attacks in Paris at the Bataclan and in Brussels, the various other attempted attacks and foiled plots that have been undertaken by people who have returned from fighting in ISIS. Sometimes they've been directed quite closely from people in Raqqa. Other times I think they've been more self-directing once they've returned. And, there's a huge security threat to the public, and I think that the rights of the law-abiding public ought to be put first. That's not to say that you don't try and integrate people as well, but that probably ought to be undertaken in prison for most of these people before they're ever released. The idea that we just sort of draw a line under it because it's all rather difficult to get to grips with and sort of try and pretend that they didn't do the terrible things they did, and they try and pretend that none of them are ever going to lapse back into extremism and pose a risk to us. I think it's taking a terrible gamble with the lives of British people.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's also this attitude of incredulity towards it all. I don't think people quite believe these individuals actually believe the things they say they do. It's almost like we assume they've made a mistake, or they're confused, or they were somehow hoodwinked into joining a sort of genocidal death cult. You touched very briefly there as well on extremist speakers, and that's a big issue, especially in the UK at the minute. And I was wondering how we balance a commitment to the principles of freedom of expression and open debate and dialogue, and combating these extremist speakers that are invited to our academic institutions and public events.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. So, of course, you mentioned about how there's this attitude that perhaps people went to go and fight for ISIS were hoodwinked. And there is even, I think, around the language of radicalization. We talk about people being radicalized as though they were sort of completely passive in this process, as they were sort of hit with the radicalization stick. And obviously, you do get people who are naive and quite young and get taken advantage of. But I think that if you look at the process of radicalization for a lot of people, they've been met halfway. They were interested and sympathetic, and there was a reason that they ended up being groomed and identified, and that's because they in some way shared the values. But I don't think we can underestimate the power of preachers and the ideology that they promote, and how how bewitching it can be to some young Muslim people who for various reasons feel alienated and hostile towards British society, and these preachers can give them a framework and a narrative of grievance that can move them along quite quickly to a place where they may be willing to consider undertaking some kind of violent act. And then, of course, with the issue of free speech, again, we sort of meet one of the great paradoxes with Islamists, because they are very happy to take advantage of the freedoms of this society. And in fact, they would insist that we are hypocrites if we don't give them the freedom to preach what they like, to have free speech, to run their own institutions as they like, with things like gender segregation and the promotion of hatred in schools. And yet, of course, we know that whenever they take over the running of a society, that the concept of the people should be free to express themselves immediately go out the window. So, this is a weakness that is used against us in this way. I think in the case of universities, it's even more difficult because of the fact that we do want universities to be a place of free debate and discussion. But I think then the emphasis has to be on debate, which is that you cannot have these situations, as we so often have had at British universities, where you get a panel made up entirely of thinkers, of preachers of one mind, who are all from the same end of the extremist spectrum. If you're going to defend the right of such individuals to come onto campus to debate, because we should have freedom of discussion, let's have freedom of discussion and insist that we have balanced platforms and that these people are at the very least challenged. And I think also challenged by the students, which is that if you had Nick Griffin try and come onto campus, the students would kick up a pretty big fuss, and they wouldn't respect his right to free speech at all. Actually, a lot of them would try and stop him from even being able to speak. But at the very least, they would, make their thoughts felt, and they would protest. But you can have, Islamist preachers coming onto British campuses any day of the week, and you won't see any demonstrating from the students.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you talk about these unchallenged panels, it just becomes one big exercise in proselytization, doesn't it? Like Dawa. We're a little while on now from the so-called Trojan horse plot, mainly concerning schools in the Birmingham and West Midlands region, things like that. And there still seems to be quite a lot of denial on that topic from people in liberal circles and the Muslim community, in the sense that they think the reports didn't find anything of significance. I just wonder what your thoughts are on this now some of the dust has settled.
Well, this actually came out again earlier this month with an event that MEND was running, which, from the way in which the event was titled and the description of the event, seemed to cast doubt on the idea that there had been any attempt to promote extremism in these Birmingham schools at all, and actually so much so that when this was exposed in some of the press and the Telegraph, the Birmingham City Council actually came out with a statement quite unequivocally, to try and deal with some of this doubt and the skepticism about it. They came out saying quite clearly what had happened and why it never needed to be repeated again. But in a way, this is how the Islamists will play good cop, bad cop, so that you'll get one group of people who will try and do something like hijacking institutions for the promotion of extremism, and then you'll get another group of Islamists who try and deny that it ever happened. And if anyone points out that it did happen, if the press points out that it did happen, then the group of Islamists who deny it will use this as a further point for promoting an extremist narrative of saying that actually the entire thing was a conspiracy, that the idea that there was an attempt by extremists to take over is an Islamophobic myth propagated by a hateful media against Muslims, so that if they succeed in taking over these institutions and find they succeed, and even when they fail, they will still use the rest of us speaking out against that attempt as a way to talk to their own community in such a way that makes them feel further alienated from wider society. And again, of course, it takes on no sense of responsibility that there might have been wrongdoing on the part of these people in the first place. I mean, I think you see it in an even worse way when it comes to the issue of terrorism itself, so that you'll get, again, the very extreme violent Islamists who will actually carry out attacks, and then you want to get another group of people who will try and justify at least the cause, justify the ideas, legitimize why these people were supposedly driven to do what they did, and at the same time try and deconstruct our whole counter-terror apparatus by claiming that it's authoritarian and Islamophobic. And so those two sort of sides of the Islamist spectrum work in tandem in a way that's quite difficult to get a grip on, actually.
So in terms of schools, a lot of the organisations that I'm a member of and support and spend time with, they will, when something like this happens, they will focus on the issue of faith schools. Again, we need to combat faith schools in general. And someone like Douglas Murray, who's part of the Henry Jackson Society, will actually disagree with that approach in terms of targeting faith schools in general when we have a problem in specific Islamic schools, or in fact some of them I think were state schools and not of a religious character at all.
Yes.
And I was wondering, where do you come down on this idea? Do you think that it's a good idea to go for faith schools in general, or do you think it's just a case of target specifics?
Well, I think that this touches on the whole issue as we try to deal with religious extremism and fundamentalism, which is that do we try and combat it by saying, well, actually our public space is religion free and is free of people trying to impose their values or their traditions, and as such it means that we therefore block the Islamists from being able to do it, but we also accept, British society also accepts that some of its own religious traditions will no longer have a place in the public square, and that would include in schools. And I can't help but feel that in a way that we lose something that's been part of our society, part of British society for a very long time, which is raising people within a particular, as in this country, it's a Christian tradition, and some of the very good values and identity that comes with that. And I actually wonder if British society becomes completely sort of tradition or religion or identity neutral, then is it actually left with almost nothing, no core identity with which to push back against the Islamists? That is, so the Islamists can say, we have a clear set of moral values and you don't have any. So why shouldn't we try and impose our values? Because you're essentially a society that's free of traditional identity and traditional values. You're sort of neutral. So I think done right that maybe faith schools and even if people aren't religious, but the idea they have some kind of cultural heritage that does accept that Christianity and some of its values have been part of our country for a long time, that it might be a way to sort of fortify British identity and bolster it against other types of extremism that have entered British society more recently. But I think it will mean that all faith schools will just have to be held to the same standard, and that will go for some maybe socially conservative Christian schools or socially conservative Jewish schools, and saying, yes, you can be a faith school, but you absolutely cannot promote ideas that would either be bigoted or that segregate people along lines of gender, those sorts of things. And you just hold the Islamic faith schools to the same standard as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting topic for this. It's one I struggle with. I'm anti religion in most forms, really. Obviously, I'm in favour of individual liberty to practice religions, but the idea of faith schools seems really off to me. But I think there really is something in this argument that once you strip away, like you've said, religious identity of a sort, or culturally Christian ethos, and you leave a neutral playing ground then for something like Islamism to thrive in, and you can see that. You can see that happening down the line, and it is a concern. But I'm not entirely sure what the solution is there. I mean, I've noticed as well that in some of your reports, you've mentioned that a lot of these groups that we've touched on actually, in some cases, meet the government's own definition of extremism. And I'm not meaning to put you on the spot, but what does that really entail in terms of what the government would view as an extreme organisation or individual?
Yeah, I mean, the government's definition is quite interesting, actually, because what it essentially says is that it considers anyone is an extremist if they vocally or actively oppose core British values, which it lists as being things like belief in democracy and tolerance for other groups and other ways of life, and also anyone who calls for the death of British troops as well is an extremist. And that doesn't mean that they are now illegal or that you've broken the law, but what it does mean is that, for instance, public bodies, public institutions shouldn't be working with you or legitimizing you in any way that essentially the prevent strategy, the counter-radicalization strategy, comes into play, and they try and stop schools, for instance, or it could be local councils or certainly the students' unions would have to be wary of this, and prisons. None of them should become uncontested spaces for extremists to operate in. And so the question is who is an extremist? I think what's interesting is, of course, that the definition uses this thing called British values, that a lot of people would say, well, actually what are listed as British values are really universal values, the belief in sort of democracy and tolerance for all different beliefs and ways of life. And I think it's interesting that the Cameron government in particular wanted to push the idea of British values, because I think it was part of this recognition that one of the reasons that we have a problem with extremism is because of the fact that the idea about a British identity was becoming so vague and so loose that how could you integrate people into something that no one could even define? So there was this need to come up with something that could be called core British values. As it happens, they struck upon universal values. But I think perhaps there should be a conversation about also asking about, are there some specifically British traditions or values or principles that we also would like us as a society to uphold or promote in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I want to touch on Prevent a little bit and the sort of state that project's in at the moment. There doesn't seem to be an appetite for it specifically from the Muslim community at large. It's often billed as this anti-Muslim legislation. It's going for Muslims, it's targeting Muslims, it's snooping on Muslims. That's the kind of things we're hearing, and that's the kind of things actually sometimes that are being echoed by our elected officials. Andy Burnham of my home city was echoing these sentiments a while back at I think a Labour conference or a Labour meeting. And how do we better, is it a case of communicating better what the legislation involves and what it's trying to prevent, or is it just a case of these people don't want any anti-extremism legislation that might focus on Muslims?
Well, it's interesting because on one hand, some of the best work that's being done in Prevent and with counter-radicalisation is actually being done by Muslims who are involved in it, including Muslim religious thinkers who have sort of a role in providing mentorship for people who are at risk of extremism and who are referred to Prevent. So there certainly are people in organisations in the Muslim community who are on board with it. But yes, there's been this massive campaign by, again, groups, and I think you have to ask what their motive is, but people who are quite extreme who have been opposing Prevent from the very beginning. And you now get to the point where you speak to politicians and you mention people in the Labour Party, and one of the reasons they say that Prevent will need to be either radically changed or rebranded or got rid of and replaced with something else is they say, well, it's become such a toxic brand and it's so, people in the Muslim community don't have faith with it. And the ridiculous thing is the reason it's become a toxic brand is because these people on the extreme end, have worked incredibly hard to make it a toxic brand and to spread a great deal of misinformation about it. And I think that politicians should be under no illusions that whatever they were to replace Prevent with, if it was effective, it would be demonized, I think, just as quickly as Prevent has been. And I think actually the key thing about Prevent is that it tries to deal with extremism of any kind. That if you read the actual Prevent sort of mission statements, as it were, it doesn't really focus on Islam or religion at all. It talks about things that are extreme and what the signs of that might be. But that could apply just as well to people on the far right. And indeed, if you look at who gets referred to Prevent, there's plenty of people on the far right who are referred to it. So this is one of the myths that are spread by extremists to try and turn the Muslim community against Prevent, which is to tell them that it focuses exclusively on Muslims and therefore that it's Islamophobic in its inception. And they actually have an even more dangerous lie than that, which is they claim not only that Prevent is Islamophobic, they claim that Prevent is seeking to criminalize Islam. They claim that it's attempting to criminalize traditional or mainstream Islamic practice and belief. And of course, what that means is if you're a very if you read Islam in a particularly literalist way, you might come to the conclusion, well, if Islam is under attack from the government in Britain, and if I am obliged to defend Islam in any situation where its free practice is restricted or limited, maybe then I'm justified in taking, some kind of violent act or some kind of act to defend Islam against British society, which is attempting to criminalize my religion. So this narrative against Prevent is incredibly dangerous, not only because it undermines the ability of Prevent to operate effectively, but also because the message could be used to further radicalize some people.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about Andy Burnham's comments as well, touching on back to what you said, he actually questioned where the legislation was for far right extremism at the same time, seemingly unaware that Prevent was also the answer to that question. It seems like if our politicians don't understand what's in it, it does have somewhat of a PR problem in general, and I suppose that isn't helped by the misinformation. I was just thinking actually. In terms of where we are in Brexit at the moment, I think it'd be fair to say that a part of why that referendum was successful for the pro-leave side was the feeling towards immigration, specifically how that ties into terrorism in a sense. And I was wondering, does the Henry Jackson Society take a position on Brexit at all?
We don't, and we didn't during the referendum, and there was, people in the organisation and supporters of the organisation who were on both sides of the debate. But what we do have since the referendum happened is we've set up quite recently this year actually something called the Global Britain Project. And although I wouldn't by any means say that it's there advocating for Brexit, what it is trying to do is, make the case for how you can have a strong and self-confident and successful Britain once it's outside of the EU, how Britain, in terms of international trade as well as in terms of geopolitics, how we can be successful as a nation. And that follows policy on the Brexit negotiations quite closely, and we'll be continuing to produce research on that. So it wasn't that we took a position either for or against, but we're trying to make sure that Britain is safe and prosperous, whether it's going to be inside or out, as it looks now, outside of the European Union.
Okay. One of the major concerns I have about Islamism in the UK in general is that it seems to me a lot of the younger generation seem to be the biggest proponents of it, and it seems like the inverse is true where it comes to Christianity. It seems like the older generation and the more conservative, the more likely to have, literal interpretations and things like that. Whereas when you sort of scratch the surface in the mainstream Muslim community, it seems to be the opposite. It seems like the younger generation are more fibre, and the younger people are more likely to go and take off to Syria and take up arms. And why do you think that that's true, where we're having a situation where young lads who's, with strong, thick Bradford accents, for instance, who were born and bred in England, feel some duty to take up arms in Syria?
Yeah, it's interesting. And if you look at what has happened in, somewhere like Leicester, it was picked up on by American officials visiting there, how they picked up particularly on the issue of dress in some neighbourhoods of Leicester, and how people were dressing in what was essentially a Saudi. The women were wearing traditional religious Saudi dress, obviously in some cases things like the burqa and niqab, despite the fact that the community in those neighbourhoods was actually Gujarati and had come from the Indian subcontinent. So in other words, you've got people in Britain whose grandmothers would have come here wearing a loose sort of sari, and they're now wearing the burqa, and that doesn't really feel like progress at all. And part of the answer for that may be that Islam in Britain, as indeed in many other parts of the world, has been heavily influenced by funding and texts and ideologues from the Wahhabi school of thought, essentially. So there has been a large effort to promote a more extreme interpretation, particularly to younger generations. But I also think it does come back to this issue, which is that we've been very unsuccessful with coming up with a model for people to integrate to, and presenting people with from those communities with something that they would perhaps like to become a part of. And I think that people do need some kind of sense of identity. So if you're not getting it from your surrounding society, then perhaps you go back to look at what's on offer in your own community. And unfortunately, the people who have been offering them an identity within their own community, the best funded and the most passionate people making the case for their own community, unfortunately, have been the extremists. But I also think it does have something to do with the fact that young people in general are more likely to be involved in extremism, and we see that on the far right as well, with a lot of the people who have got mixed up on the far right have been quite young. And so I think it is also an issue to do with young people sort of trying to find themselves and trying to fit in, and sometimes people make wrong decisions, and also sometimes people get preyed on at that age as well.
And get hit with a radicalisation stick.
Yeah, exactly.
I've really enjoyed speaking to you about this, Tom. You speak a lot of sense. Before we wrap up, is there any other topic you really wanted to touch on before I let you get back to your evening? No,
I mean, look, I think that we covered in pretty in depth, really, the issue that we are facing now as far as Islamist extremism is concerned, and I think that some of the issues parallel with the far right. And all I would say is that I think that in most Western democracies, including in Britain, that we've had a sort of consensus of tolerance, really, where people realise that nobody wants to be coerced and nobody wants to be oppressed, and that as a result, we live in a society where people are allowed to live their lives and pursue happiness as they choose, and in return you don't try and impose your beliefs on anyone else. And unfortunately, the Islamists haven't caught on to this yet, and they still believe in a type of politics based on imposing their beliefs on other people. And all we have to do as a society, I think, is reconnect with that fundamental tradition of believing in individual liberty, and hopefully persuading these people that that's a much more dignified and preferable way to live.
Yeah, exactly. I agree wholeheartedly with that. Do you have a social media presence at all that you want to point people towards?
A little bit. I'm sometimes on Twitter, but not a great deal. But you can find my work is published on the Henry Jackson Society website, and we also have a channel on YouTube where we put up some of our sort of media appearances. So you'll see some of my work there as well.
Excellent. I shall include links to them. Tom, thank you very much for your time once again.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Godless Spell Checker podcast. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please consider supporting by visiting gspellchecker.com/support. From here, you can either become a Patreon subscriber, or you can give a one-off donation through PayPal, or you can just follow some instructions on how best to share the podcast on social media. Put it on a memory stick, throw it at people, whatever works best. Any support's greatly appreciated. Think we've all learned something here today?